Michael Saylor has 1% of the Bitcoin supply, right? But he has no way of building a block any faster or better than anybody else. An idea like Bitcoin is a great way to cultivate that impulse for liberty and impulse for a lack of government intervention in our lives, because everyone gets to see right now in front of them in real time, Bitcoin perform with no help from the government at all. Just because Bitcoin got approved, it is not by any means a blank check for Ethereum or any other proof of stake token. So you have these two kind of different things. So Bitcoin was approved and going down, and Ethereum was going up on the hopes of approval. And I think a lot of people thought that this was a done deal. Ethereum futures are already approved by the SEC, so this is a perfect setup for Ethereum approval. But as you know, I was fairly early in saying that I didn't think that these products line up quite so well.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week I have on Bryan Jacoutot. Bryan, welcome.
Very good to be here, Joe.
Yeah, glad to have you. Let's talk about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin ETF, and a potential Ethereum ETF. When it comes to, approving an Ethereum ETF, what hurdles do you see to getting that done? And then how does that compare to Bitcoin's history of, getting the Bitcoin ETF approved?
I think in order to discuss kind of the hurdles for the Ethereum ETF, it really does help to go back first and look at the process of the Bitcoin ETF approval, because, in the very first place, we're all enjoying, Bitcoin ETF approval land right now, and the price is certainly reflecting a large interest in it. But it's important to remember that the SEC only voted 3-2 to approve the Bitcoin Well, and I also want to just say at the outset, they're technically ETPs, and the SEC always wants to call them ETPs, but I think just for the sake of not confusing everybody, we can stick with ETF. But they only voted 3-2 to approve the ETF. And, Commissioner Peirce and Commissioner, I think it's pronounced Uyeda, they were firmly on the side of approving the ETF. But Gensler had to kind of be dragged there. And, they only voted 3-2 in the context of the DC Court of Appeals essentially making them. So courts, basically what happened is, there were several denials to ETF applications over a number of years. And eventually Grayscale, the GBTC ETF, ended up suing in court, taking them to court. And courts will give pretty wide latitude to agencies like the SEC interpreting federal statutes, kind of under the theory that Congress delegates authority to these professional agencies. This is sort of all that they do. Congress has a very broad set of things it has to deal with. So these agencies are theoretically supposed to be subject matter experts, and they delegate authority to them. And now the wisdom of this policy of courts deferring and giving wide latitude to agencies is kind of like a separate question. And it's often under attack. And I think it's probably under attack by many of the folks looking to get ETF approvals for their various cryptocurrencies. It's probably a little outside the scope of this discussion, but that's just the way it is. Courts give them a lot of deference. So after the SEC denied the Bitcoin ETF the last time, Grayscale finally took them to court. And under the law, if you appeal denial from the SEC, it goes straight to the DC Court of Appeals. So there's no real trial court or anything like that. You see a lot of enforcement actions where the SEC is arguing in front of a federal judge, and there's potentially a jury present. Sometimes there isn't. This just goes straight to the Court of Appeals. So at the DC Court of Appeals, the question was whether the SEC properly interpreted the Exchange Act with respect to the spot Bitcoin ETF. And again, going back to that deferential standard, courts will only set aside an agency action if the action is arbitrary and capricious, which is, lawyer terminology, which we can get into the meaning of later, or they'll deny it if it's otherwise inconsistent with the law. So breaking that down, kind of like an easy way to think about it is, while they get a lot of deference from the courts, they can't straight up violate the law. So if a statute says that the SEC must approve applications if they get 50,000 signatures from the public, and an application gets 51,000 and the SEC says, I don't want to approve that even though you got 51,000, the court's going to set that aside because that is a straight up violation of the statutory text. The one that's a little bit harder is the arbitrary and capricious standard. And this is what the grayscale case centered on. And what it means is essentially that a court will have to consider whether an agency decision is reasonable and reasonably explained within the context of the statutory enabling language. And that gives the SEC a lot of wiggle room, and courts don't want to substitute their policy judgment for the agencies, particularly since courts are kind of unelected, lifetime appointed. In the federal system, they're unelected, lifetime appointed judges. So another way to kind of think of it is that the courts essentially just tell the agency you have to treat similar situations similarly. Treat like cases alike. And when you don't, if an agency decides to make treat a similar situation differently, you have to at least adequately explain why you're doing so. So the theory in the grayscale case for the Bitcoin ETF approval was that the SEC already approved the futures, the Bitcoin futures ETF. So these are very similar products. They have very similar market exposure. The futures and spot prices are really, really tightly correlated. I think there was a comment to the Bitcoin ETF proposal that said there's something like the price is like 99.9% correlated. So it's really tight correlation. And the surveillance sharing agreement that was needed for the futures would work sufficiently well for spot as well. And then finally, I think they said that granting a spot ETF isn't going to give the ETF market any sort of outsized control over the price, because the Bitcoin market is very large. It's over $1 trillion, and it's very liquid as well. Now, I think the reality has proven that the ETF has had quite an effect on the price, but that's neither here nor there because we're already past the approval. So I just don't know if they were correct on that. So the DC Court of Appeals, kind of considering all that, said essentially to the SEC, you cannot deny the spot ETF having already approved the futures ETF. You cannot deny it on the basis of essentially saying that we're worried that the market's too small and that there could be fraud and we won't be able to stop it, because the products are too similar essentially. So they had to give them, the DC Circuit said 3-0, by the way, it's a panel of 3 judges, and they said come up with a better explanation or approve it essentially. And the important thing is too that the DC Circuit case, they didn't approve it themselves. The court didn't say, okay, we approve. So they sent it back to the SEC, and that's when they had their 3-2 vote. And that's when Gary Gensler sort of jumped sides and said, after all these times denying them, we're going to approve them. Now, this is what obviously led to you created the approval for the spot Bitcoin ETF, and it's what caused the massive quick, I don't know if you remember the quick Ethereum price approval, right? It kind of popped through like 20% really quickly on the heels of Bitcoin. And I believe at the time, actually, Bitcoin was going down because it was kind of experiencing that quick little downtick after approval where everyone, I think, sold the news a little bit. Yeah. So you had these two kind of different things. So Bitcoin was approved and going down, and Ethereum was going up on the hopes of approval. And I think a lot of people thought that this was a done deal. Ethereum futures are already approved by the SEC, so this is a perfect setup for Ethereum approval. But as you know, I think I was fairly early in saying that I didn't think that these products line up quite so well.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think originally the SEC had like reasonable concerns for not approving the Bitcoin ETF? I understand like where you're coming from, saying that like, okay, they can use this precedent of the futures ETF existing to actually get it approved. But like, was there a legit concern to not approve it, or was that just why did they not approve it? At the start. I mean,
I think I think legitimate, whether it's legitimate, I guess, is in the eyes of the beholder a little bit. But I think from the SEC's perspective is this is a very new product. Even Bitcoin, it's only 15 years of history. It's not like when they approved the gold ETF, it had 6,000 years of history. So there is some legitimacy to it. But I think at the end of the day, when they decided to approve futures, for Bitcoin at least, it didn't make a lot of sense not to approve spot anymore. Because there's no real distinction between the futures contracts and the underlying Bitcoin spot price. For Ethereum, though, I do see distinctions. Primarily, I think back on the day or the day after the ETF approval, when I sent out that thread, I was saying, number one, a big distinction is the securities potential classification of Ethereum as an unregistered security. If you read the Coinbase, I think he's the not CFO, he's chief legal counsel. if you read his threads, he will often, and I often disagree with him on this, but he will often say, just kind of conclusory, that Ethereum's a commodity, right? The SEC's already admitted this. So, case closed. He has this very conclusory, Coinbase doesn't offer unregistered securities on its platform. Ethereum's on its platform. So therefore, Ethereum's not an unregistered security. And so I disagree with that. I don't think the SEC has ever said that Ethereum is not a security. They have, I think, sort of passively accepted through the futures approval that the CFTC thinks it's a commodity, but that doesn't end the inquiry. That's not a slam dunk just because they haven't actively opposed it. They also constantly look at the speech by Bill Hinman, I think was commissioner, or he was director of corporate finance or something in the SEC. And in 2018, he gave a speech at the Yahoo Finance Summit saying that Ethereum, and he suggested that Ethereum had reached a quote unquote sufficient level of decentralization so to convert it from what was formerly an unregistered security into a commodity. And that is a constant refrain of that speech. And I think this is why Gary Gensler, when he goes to Congress and he's on TV, and they're always like, hey, is Ethereum a security? Or why won't you just say it? Or why won't you say it's not a security? And he's always like, I can't talk about it. And I think his Bill Hinman speech is why, because everyone is quoting that all the time as if the SEC, that counts as SEC approval. And I think he was just kind of speaking from his personal opinion, and he's kind of theorizing about a way in which Ethereum could be considered a commodity, but very far from an agency position. So I think that explains Gensler's reticence these days. But yeah, so that uncertain status in and of itself makes Ethereum a less shoe-in sort of to just kind of ride the coattails of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has always been considered a commodity from its outset. I mean, it had no pre-mine. It had a valueless circulation period of almost a year, I think. And it has always been fairly well distributed. There is no founder to kind of exercise undue influence. There is no Ethereum Foundation type thing for Bitcoin where, they kind of ran the show for a long time to some degrees. I think what many would argue still do. So I don't think that Ethereum gets to ride the coattails of the Bitcoin ETF approval just very, very tightly the way, maybe it could if it was sort of made in a way that was more like Bitcoin without its pre-mine. So that's issue number one, the lingering potential for the securities classification. And now we have, I don't know if you saw, but we have the investigation by the SEC into they're asking for information into the Ethereum Foundation, among other organizations that were kind of there at the beginning and that are responsible for changing it from proof of work to proof of stake. And that alone is what I think. Again, remember the deferential standard. Courts just say you have to have a reasonable explanation for approving futures and not approving spot. Bitcoin, they didn't have that. They couldn't get there, although two commissioners thought that they did. So remember that too. So it's really tight on Bitcoin in that respect. Now they can say, well, during the Ethereum futures approval process, we didn't have an ongoing investigation, and now we do. And that alone, I think, is a rational basis for the SEC to say, let's at least delay again. They already delayed, I believe today, they delayed approval till the end of May now. And I think that they can continue riding that delay on the basis of their investigation potentially. So that's a huge development, at least in terms of the likelihood of an ETF approval. I don't know if it's a huge development in whether Ethereum is going to be considered a security or not, but it's at least at minimum, it's good for that. Like it's a good, reasonable explanation that can differentiate the two products now. Yeah,
very fair. What would happen if Ethereum is declared an unregistered security? Like, what would that really mean for Ethereum?
Yeah, so it's good to look at kind of a few that have been declared that, and they don't necessarily, they don't die. In this space, there's always a speculator that is willing to say, put up some cash and hope that they get another 100x return. I mean, there is just they call themselves degens for a reason, and I believe them when they say it. But so, what would likely happen is kind of fines, disgorgement of ill-gotten gains for the founders, things like that. They may, potentially prohibit. A lot of times they'll prohibit folks from operating in the industry for a number of years, 5-10 years, something like that. That happens, every so often with these SEC rulings. So it would certainly greatly diminish its value, I think, because then if it's an unregistered security, you can't really trade it without getting a fine or notice from the SEC, even on secondary markets and things like that. So it's a huge problem just for the network. I don't know, but again, I don't know if I doubt that it kills it. I think it would probably continue. It would just have to find its way into becoming commoditized and or at least compliant with the SEC regulations, which I don't think is impossible. They got a lot of money behind this thing, so they could certainly theoretically become compliant. And if you look at like the Telegram case, they started their own cryptocurrency. They got in trouble for unregistered securities often, and I think the TON, it's called TON, Telegram Open Network Coin token, is like a top 20 coin or something like that right now on CoinMarketCap. So, it's not a death knell, but it's obviously not great either for them. And the other thing too, I think the big thing that it does is it removes any likelihood of getting an Ethereum ETF probably in perpetuity, at least not for a long time. It kind of removes that, which based on my read of the Ethereum folks that I interact with or listen to on the podcast and things like that, they're really excited about it, Ethereum ETF, because they think it's going to really launch the network and bring the coin up and value and all that. So I think it'd be kind of a crushing blow in that respect, but I don't think it kills the network or anything.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see what actually happens if it was declared an unregistered security, because I guess if it was declared that, obviously I guess Coinbase would probably have to delist it, like I would guess relatively quickly. And then if they did go the route of becoming registered and like admitting that, it is a security, then it's like, what's even the value of Ethereum to begin with if it's not a decentralized token? Yeah.
I mean, it's a great question. And again, like there's a lot of decentralization theater, obviously, in this space. There is a lot of kind of like false, people will say this is as a marketing tactic. Well, they'll tell you how decentralized their token is, even though it is completely centralized. And they talk about how important decentralization is in order to get buyers into the network. And I look at like things like Solana and things like that, or Cardano, where you have a very centralized token and a very centralized issuance, and nobody really cares. They just buy it anyway because they're all speculating on it. So the value in decentralization exists with Bitcoin, right? You need it for a worldwide monetary unit. You have to have that. Otherwise, the alternative is this kind of dystopian CBDC, essentially. So there's a huge value in it for Bitcoin. But for these little science projects and these guys are doing DeFi and NFTs, then it's literally just marketing, it seems like, for me, in a lot of respects. I don't think they have the commitment to it. And I think, Ethereum, by going out into, they're not doing talking about L2s and L3s, they had their Dencun upgrade or something recently. I don't know if you heard about that in the blobs, but they're sort of admitting that they can't really scale even with their proof of stake shift. They can't scale on L1, so they're sacrificing a lot of decentralization to go towards a proof of stake model, and then they're just building out on L2 and L3 anyway. So yeah, I'm not sure how committed the industry is to the concept of decentralization outside of Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great point. On the topic of proof of stake versus proof of work, do you think that will play into the SEC's consideration of whether this is a security or not a security, or does that really matter, the different consensus mechanisms between Bitcoin proof of work and Ethereum proof of stake?
I think it should. I think that the change from proof of work to proof of stake is very important. So like Ethereum has securitization and centralization problems, I think, in like both phases of its life. For the proof of work phase, the ICO was likely, it was likely an unregistered securities offering. Now, they seem to be outside the statute of limitations for the SEC on this. That's the general consensus, typically 5 years, and that would be 2020, and so nothing happened. But there is a law that was passed in 2021, and this is just me kind of theorizing here, but there was a law in 2021 passed, big omnibus law that allows the SEC to expand that statute of limitations to 10 years in cases of fraud and certain other kind of delineated events. So, potentially they could reach back to the ICO using something like that. I don't know how plausible that is. But even if you don't, you have the continuing, the ongoing problem of the proof of stake model now with staking as a service and the securitization through that model. And recall again too the deferential standard that courts give when they're analyzing these ETFs and the SEC's decision whether to approve or not to approve. Recall again that the SEC doesn't want to approve any of these, from the starting point. At least the majority of the commission doesn't want to. I think Hester Peirce, certainly she's, what do they call her, crypto mom or something like that. I think that she would love to approve a lot of them, but I don't think the majority of the commission does. So when you have that kind of as your starting point, then you have to consider whether the SEC has a reasonable basis to treat these, the futures product versus the ETF differently, the spot ETF differently.
With tax day on April 15th, high net worth Bitcoin holders could be leaving a lot of money on the table if they don't have a sound financial plan and tax strategy. Sound Advisory is a leading financial advisory firm for long-term Bitcoin holders like yourself. They can help you maximize your Bitcoin wealth while navigating the complexities of the legacy financial system. Don't get killed on taxes. Check out Sound Advisory at thesoundadvisory.com for more information. That's thesoundadvisory.com. Now back to the show.
So for Bitcoin, a proof of work chain that is very successful in an ETF, you're gonna accrue a lot of tokens and things, a lot of coins within the ETF itself. But that doesn't affect the underlying kind of functionality of the protocol or the ability to detect or limit maybe fraud in the market. Like, Michael Saylor has 1% of the Bitcoin supply, right? But he has no way of building a block any faster or better than anybody else. But for proof of stake, that may not be the case because, where the consensus rules depend on primarily social consensus, having the ETFs accrue a ton of say they're very popular just the way Bitcoin is. If they accrue a ton of tokens, theoretically, they get a lot of staking power and a lot of ability to affect outcomes and update the chain and things like that. I'm not sure that could become a potential problem for detecting fraud. It could become a potential, I don't think you call it a 51% attack in proof of stake, but it could become a way to update the consensus in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So essentially attacking the network using your stake. And so if I'm the SEC, I think that's a compelling reason to say, hey, look, this merger to proof of stake changed things. And if we allow, when you're in a futures mode and you're buying futures contracts, you're not aggregating a bunch of Ethereum into one custodian. You are doing contracts based on the underlying product. But when you're aggregating a bunch of Ethereum tokens into an ETF, you're suddenly growing your share of your ability to influence outcomes on the network. And then also you're growing your ability to because the reward of staking is more coins, right? So you're growing your ability to influence outcomes even more than people are just giving them to you. You're actually organically creating more control. So by creating, the SEC can just simply say, look, we can't control the market in the way we can with Bitcoin, because if they aggregate a bunch of Bitcoin into an ETF, that is what it is, right? They have a lot of Bitcoin. But if you aggregate a bunch of Ethereum into an ETF, suddenly you have a single point of failure for attack on the network. They have that ability in proof of stake that just doesn't exist in proof of work. And a common response to this too is let's just not have them stake. We could just create an ETF where we have a contractual agreement to not stake the token. So that's not really persuasive to me for two reasons. One is applicants, I think Fidelity and others have already updated their application to say, we want to stake. And I completely understand why they want to do that, because you look at the Bitcoin ETF inflows and they got to be salivating at the idea of generating Ethereum on the basis of their own aggregated stake. So they're not going to want to walk away and leave that on the table. So they're updating their applications, which suggests that it's unlikely that anyone would just forego staking if they had an ETF and they could consolidate all of that into one custodian. But the other thing is even if they did do that, then you are taking a ton of Ethereum off the table for purposes of consensus, and it's centralizing in two ways, right? You're either centralizing it into an ETF where you're aggregating a bunch of Ethereum tokens and giving them outsized influence, or you're taking a huge chunk of what should be consensus creating supply in the ecosystem, and you're taking it off the table and basically giving the people who have a lot of tokens that aren't in the ETF more authority over the network than they otherwise would have. So again, these are potential problems that I'm seeing with an ETF, with using a proof of stake coin in an ETF, in an ETF wrapper, essentially. And I think it's plenty good reason for the SEC to tell the courts, here's our distinguishing factor. We didn't have this with Bitcoin. We have this with Ethereum. And a court, given the deferential standard the deferential posture that they have with the agency, I think is going to be kind of hard pressed to say, that's not enough. We need more. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the Ethereum approval and why, or lack of approval, and why, it's just because Bitcoin got approved, it is not by any means a blank check for Ethereum or any other proof of stake token, which is kind of the corollary of that is the SEC now can say, look, here's our logical stopping point. Congress, you want to know where these stop? They stop at Bitcoin. It's a commodity. We know it's a commodity, and we really have never said it wasn't a commodity. It's got a deep liquid pool of capital, $1.4 trillion market cap right now, something like that. It's very decentralized. It doesn't have a leader. The likelihood of fraud is diminished relative to all the other cryptocurrencies. So yes, we approved Bitcoin, but we're not going to approve Ethereum and Dogecoin and Dog with Hat coin and all these other coins that these folks are pointing out, because this is it is very much a slippery slope argument that I'm making, but the SEC is going to have to be hard pressed if they have to now approve Ethereum. Then why not approve XRP? And why isn't that a security? And why not approve Dogecoin? And why not approve all these markets? And they're going to, their hands are going to be tied because they're unable to distinguish it if they can't do it in this way. And I think that they can do it in the way that we've discussed, and it makes it for a very logical stopping point, and allows the Bitcoin market to mature and crypto kind of to figure itself out for a while until it gets a little more serious.
That seems very, very logical to me. I do have a question kind of relating to unregistered securities, like in Ethereum, and how you kind of said like the window to, I guess, sue for the Ethereum ICO is kind of gone as of right now, but it may come back for another reason that you suggested. Is that like in the world of unregistered securities, is that because like the Ethereum ICO is like relatively successful? Like, for example, like if you come out with, you raise money in an unregistered way and you raise $1 billion and the company just fails and everyone loses their money, I'd imagine there's going to be a lot of people mad and suing. But with the Ethereum ICO, it's like, yes, like Ethereum, is not the same as Bitcoin, but 10 years ago, if you had bought Bitcoin or Ethereum, you did pretty well. You made a lot of dollars from your investment. So it's like, is that a reason as to why it was never declared a security? Because like everyone that invested in the unregistered security was like very happy with their returns.
That's a really good question. And I guess the ultimate answer might be, and to give the Ethereum folks their credit, it might be that it's not a security, and the SEC is just not interested in pursuing it. I don't think that's the case. I think, and I think the Ethereum folks also have a lot of merit in their point of view that it's kind of like the SEC has been throwing out mixed messages a little bit with its enforcement actions, because in 2017, when they did the report on the DAO hack, and that caused the Ethereum fork that made Ethereum versus Ethereum Classic, they essentially laid the groundwork for saying that ICOs are largely going to be securities, and they neglected to bring that home against Ethereum at the time, and that was well within the statute of limitations period. They could have brought it home, and they didn't. And so Ethereum folks, I think rightfully, have some anger with the SEC for giving those mixed messages, because they felt that they've been kind of cleared. But at the same time, the SEC never cleared them, right? So they're left with kind of like whatever, they're left with their situation as it is. But I think to your question, I don't really know why the SEC didn't pursue that action within that 5-year time limitation. Again, it could be that they feel that maybe there was some fraud. And when I say fraud, what I'm referring to is when the ICO occurred, the wallets were technically anonymized, or at least pseudonymized and things like that. And so one person might have aggregated 10, 50, 100 wallets or something to make it look like they weren't really buying a whole lot, but they're buying generous chunks, but nothing crazy. And then you aggregate all 100 of those wallets, and suddenly you've got a huge centralization issue, particularly if when the stated plan was to move to proof of stake eventually. So you sell a pre-mine, and then you give the people with the most tokens outsized authority on the consensus. That's a problem. And so what I'm saying, I guess, is the SEC might view something like that as potentially fraudulent behavior, and then hopefully get you to that 10 years where they can pursue the pursue even as far back as the original ICO. And it is kind of interesting timing that this case is, or excuse me, the investigation into the investigation into the Ethereum Foundation. I'm not sure if they're investigating the Ethereum Foundation. They're just asking questions of the Ethereum Foundation. But it's interesting that the timing is because we're now here in essentially Q2 2024, and I think the ICO was 2015. So the clock on the 10-year timeline is getting real close too, and now there's movement. So I don't know if those two things are related or anything. Kind of pure speculation on my part. But it may be that it's just it's a new technology. It's tough to understand, and they had to get their ducks in a row. At one point you had guys like Bill Hinman at the commission saying, "Hey, it's sufficiently decentralized," and then at another point you have other commissioners who are completely against this. And so it might have just been the political kind of will of the agency to aggregate everybody and get a plan of action. I also don't know if they felt that because this was all, the DAO hack was before the ICO mania, when I think the SEC and Wall Street and investors really realized how big of a problem these ICOs are from an investment perspective. I mean, they were just loads of garbage that were, ballooning up to like $50 billion market caps overnight. And then crashing to zero. So it may have been like, hey, this isn't a big deal until it is. And now they're trying to scramble and get their stuff together before the statute limitations runs out. And then, of course, even if we assume that the 10-year statute doesn't apply and it's still limited to 5, I think the theory that they have is that even if the secondary market sales can constitute ongoing violations. So the statute runs from each ongoing violation of securities law. So even if the ICO somehow makes it out, the secondary market sales could potentially provide a vehicle for them to continue going after Ethereum, indefinitely while they're on the secondary market.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one. Like, from a legal perspective, is the difference between like a security and a commodity, is that like a completely binary, outcome? Like, is it possible that because of crypto and everything that there is a new term that's like somewhere in the middle that's like, because I think of things like Ethereum and other tokens that I obviously don't have, but I think of them somewhat as like Chuck E. Cheese tokens, where it's like you start a Chuck E. Cheese, you sell the tokens that have no claim on the future cash flows of Chuck E. Cheese, but it allows you to go to Chuck E. Cheese and play the games at Chuck E. Cheese. Doesn't mean that even if the business is successful, it still probably is not a good investment, but people are investing in it, I guess, to some extent, or they think they are. Like, is there a reason to maybe assume that like there's a new term created, or is that just like not even a real thing?
No, I mean, I think in part that was the whole utility argument that a lot of folks made, particularly even at the creation of Ethereum. It was, hey, it's gas for the network. Remember, that was like their whole thing. And I think the courts have kind of largely disagreed. A lot of the lower level federal courts that have had occasion to examine a lot of these tokens, like the library token, the Telegram token, there's a couple other ones too. They've taken the utility argument and said, okay, thank you, but even if it has utility, it can still be a security. So like your Chuck E. Cheese token doesn't have any issues with being a security because no one is collecting or buying Chuck E. Cheese tokens to use them for twice their value in 5 years or 10 years or things like that. And it's certainly not. Yeah. So it's I think to answer your question is it's unlikely that there's any merit to the kind of the utility argument. But there's also, in the securities laws, they have statutorily defined securities like a stock or a bond or things that are just this is a security, and it's no question because you know exactly what it is. But where these assets intersect with the securities laws is the more umbrella term of an investment contract, and that's what it just says in the statutory language. An investment contract is a security. The question is, what's an investment contract, right? And so that's how we have Howey, and that's how we have all the 4-prong and 3-prong tests and things like that.
In this frontier moment, Bryan mentioned the Howey test, which is used to determine if something is a security or a commodity. The origin of the test is actually from the case SEC versus Howey. In the case, Howey sold portions of orange groves in Florida to investors, offering them the option to lease the land back to Howey for growing and selling the produce. The marketing emphasized significant profits, targeting non-local, inexperienced investors. This fits the legal case's definition of an investment contract, defined by 4 key points. 1, an investment of money. 2, in a common enterprise. 3, with the reasonable expectation of profits. And 4, due to the managerial efforts of others. In this example, the orange groves were classified as a security, and it sounds like many cryptos may be too. And now back to Bryan.
And so that's why there's a lot of uncertainty still in the space after 15 years, I think, about whether these assets are securities or not, because they're still trying to iron out that really broad term and how it applies to this entirely new industry, particularly when that broad term was, laid down during, it was closer to the Prohibition era and the Civil War, I think, than it was to today. So it's a challenge for the industry, and you can probably find some of these are securities and some of them aren't, and maybe you will, but we're not there yet.
Fair. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like before 15 years ago, if you had told like a lawyer at the SEC or a lawyer like yourself, like if you explain something like Ethereum and you're like, what is this thing? Like you would be like, how does this thing even exist? Like this, you're creating a scenario that doesn't even really make sense, but it's so fascinating. But I definitely agree with you. Like obviously people that are buying crypto in Ethereum and whatnot, they definitely are buying it because they think the price is going to.
Yeah. There's number go up memes everywhere for a reason. And it's like very few people I feel like are, buying these tokens, to use them. They're buying them to secure their bags and dump on retail and all that stuff. And I think that's just a reality of the industry.
For sure. How about proof slashing and proof of stake, right? Like, is that another concern when it comes to approving like an ETF? Like my understanding with slashing is the concept of whoever, a majority of the Ethereum that's staked can theoretically like cut off or like say, like, hey, this small segment of Ethereum is invalid, and they, we're basically like saying that this Ethereum doesn't exist. Is that like a major concern since like the ETF, would potentially have a lot of Ethereum or potentially move a lot of the staking out of the ETF into the hands of, a small group of people?
Yeah, the slashing thing is interesting because again, that gives you another kind of differentiator between spot and futures, right? Futures, you can't slash your futures contracts, but you can certainly slash if you're staking it, because you have to be staking it to get run that risk. But seems like that's what the ETFs want to do. And so, yeah, what happens if the social consensus layer says we need to slash this set of tokens, and then all of a sudden people who have a claim to Ethereum, a paper claim, no longer have the underlying asset? Is the ETF required to go back into the market and buy to reestablish one-to-one the paper claim to the actual spot claim? Or if it doesn't, is that how you kind of get like a weird kind of rehypothecation issue where there's more paper claims to the underlying Ethereum held in the ETF? I don't know. Like, so again, it's an interesting question, and it's exactly why the SEC is going to say we shouldn't approve this just yet because we don't really know how this is going to shake out if we were to approve it. We don't know what it means in terms of our clients or the exchange's clients' funds.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I can definitely see it getting extremely confusing if the slashing stuff gets involved and some people think they have coins and some people really don't have coins and the community is fighting internally with each other. It would be quite crazy. And then I think something else that came to mind, it's also related to Bitcoin, is forks. I feel like if there is another hard fork that is debated within the community over the coming 5 years, 10 years, whether that's Bitcoin or Ethereum, it's like, how are the ETFs going to play a role in that? And like, are the ETFs going to distribute coins to, is it going to be like a spinoff of a new ETF that gets created? Like, do you have any ideas on how that might play out or thoughts on like hard forks and ETFs?
Yeah, I mean, the hard forks are certainly a problem for anything, Bitcoin included, when it comes to the ETFs. And I imagine the way it would be dealt with is simple contractual terms, the way kind of it is with Coinbase or anybody else who custodies large sums of the underlying asset for their clients. But yeah, it'd be interesting if you have a fork, and does BlackRock keep the fork of the both forks essentially, and then it can just go with the one that ends up prevailing and then sell off the one that doesn't prevail? Or could it induce a sale? Or could it basically induce a winner in a fork war by selling off one, by picking one and selling it off? It's a very interesting question. I don't know what the outcome would be, but I think largely though is how they deal with it is going to be handled contractually with their clients rather than. I mean, they're not going to have any protocol level layer or anything like that because that's one of the downsides of the ETF is you're buying a claim to the underlying Bitcoin. You're not buying the underlying Bitcoin, and so you don't necessarily get access to any fork or anything like that. And you do give a custodian a little bit more authority that hopefully can be reined in using traditional law, traditional contract, things like that. But at the end of the day, they 9/10 of the law, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? And they've got the possession because you didn't want to take the time to custody your own Bitcoin at Unchained.
Exactly. Yeah. While I have you here, from a regulatory perspective, what do you think is like the biggest threat to Bitcoin? Like, is there anything that's pressing that could come down from various agencies, from the federal government, from state governments? Is there anything that, that you think would be a threat to Bitcoin or could at least hinder adoption within the United States?
Yeah, I mean, there's unfortunately right now there's threats from all sides. It's mostly politically based, though. We've got the kind of threat as to energy usage. People who don't take the time to understand not just that Bitcoin right now isn't really much of an energy suck, or at least not a non-renewable energy suck, but they don't understand that like right now Bitcoin is helping power grids and things like that, and helping stabilize power grids in Texas, and providing somewhere to kind of offshoot extra electricity from nuclear power plants. Like there's here in Georgia, there's Plant Vogtle that would be an excellent tenant. I'm not sure if they have any Bitcoin miners, but nuclear power makes a ton of energy, and it's not always all used very efficiently. So if you could just flip on some Bitcoin miners to make some money while you kind of burn off the unneeded energy, that's something that's good for Plant Vogtle. It's good for the jobs that are there. It's good for the people in the surrounding community to kind of have a steady, predictable flow of energy. Probably can reduce their energy cost as well. Then that would be great. And then you've got folks using solar power here in Georgia, and using it during off hours to mine Bitcoin. And so there's a lot of misconceptions around Bitcoin mining, and it's a huge target for the regulatory apparatus right now. We think we had recently that EIA letter to one of the Bitcoin miners, Riot Blockchain, and I think they're Riot Blockchain. I don't know if I think they might have changed it just to Riot now, but
yeah. I think right now they're they changed it to Riot Platforms.
Yeah, I like that better.
In this frontier moment, Bryan is talking about the EIA letter to Riot Platforms. The EIA recently sent a letter to 137 Bitcoin miners in the US, requiring them to report their electricity usage to the current administration. Fortunately, the EIA faced legal challenges regarding its mandate to collect this data, and the Texas Blockchain Council and Riot Platforms filed a lawsuit and won in court. On Twitter, Pierre Richard, who's VP of Research at Riot Platforms, even pointed out that they already have this information. Utilities are already required to report their annual electricity sales by customer type. So there's no lack of transparency. In fact, there's an abundance of data and research showing that Bitcoin miners are zero emission and good for balancing the grid. Bitcoin miners are electric money printers. Just like electric cars, they have zero emissions. And now back to Bryan.
So they had to send out go to court and get a TRO to stop the EIA from collecting this information. Now, it was maybe a small issue in the grand scheme of things, but that's kind of that's a huge attack vector for Bitcoin now, because it's playing where the big boys play. It's in Wall Street. It's in these massive power grids. Bitcoin does consume a good deal of energy, but it's for a good purpose, because you need to secure the most valuable asset in the world. And so you have to deal with the kind of regulatory result of bad information being out there, and it's a tough slog. It requires a lot of capital to do so. Just the same way mining Bitcoin requires a lot of capital to do so. But it's worth it, I think, because eventually everyone's going to be subject to the same information. I think they're going to come to a very similar conclusion on Bitcoin, unless you're kind of biased against it for whatever reason. But that's our big problem. We've got regulatory agencies attacking it, and then you've got people in Congress who don't like the fact that there's valuable, there's a good form of money out there that they don't have kind of the control over the way they do with the dollar. They don't like the fact that people can privately transact. They're just not used to it. And ever since, they haven't been used to it since the 60s, but really it went to hyperdrive post 9/11. And so for 20 years, the U.S. Congress has had very good information on every transaction. And as each transaction gets more and more digital, more digitized, they have better information. And so this is a big step the other direction, which I think is good from a philosophical standpoint. I think it's a good thing. But Congress is not going to like that, and I doubt that they'll go down without a fight. But again, as we can persuade more and more people in Congress and elsewhere in the state houses and things like that this is a net benefit for society, I think we ultimately win. But it's those are our two attackers. Because if we don't do that, and we don't spend the time and resources to do that and to educate and to fight back in these litigations that are not very high profile litigations, but are very, very necessary. We run the risk of making the trip for Bitcoin from here to where it can be a much more difficult one and a much slower one.
Yeah, it's a great point. I know this is kind of another related question to what I just asked, but I feel like the 2024 presidential election is starting to sneak up on us. Do you think that Bitcoin will play a role in federal elections or local elections at all in the future? Will it be this year? Will it be 2028? Like, I imagine as Bitcoin gets bigger and more people in the US have a significant chunk of their net worth in Bitcoin, it's going to be like a pretty important, it's going to be pretty important to them. So, politicians that threaten it may be, immediate no's for a number of people. Do you think Bitcoin will play a role?
Yeah, I don't know how big it'll be in 2024. I know that, I don't know if Biden's been asked, but I know Trump has been asked about it. And I think he essentially just said, I'm not going to mess with it. It was like, he doesn't like it, but he's not going to, essentially not going to mess with it either. And I wouldn't expect him necessarily to get it. He spent his whole life in the traditional financial system, and it's just hard for people to unlearn that sort of thing. But as long as you leave it alone, you're good, you're fine with me. So that's one way. It's becoming like a political topic on the campaign trail for even the highest office, which is very cool. Obviously you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about it all the time. And I don't, even Joe Biden he's been definitely hostile towards it, but maybe less so than you might think. I mean, at least he's not on the level of Elizabeth Warren hostility, which is good. So it's on the campaign trail. I think there's a good chunk of voters who will. I don't want to say they'll make it a single issue for them, but it will affect their decision-making process. And then, of course, you have the folks who are going to make it, the diehard folks who are going to make it a single issue for them. So it will. It's already affecting politics, and it will continue. I think it will only get bigger as it gets more and more understood. It gets more and more kind of ingrained in our economy through Wall Street and through, like I said, energy sector and things like that. Jobs. People are, that's politics 101. Every 2 minutes you see a politician saying, I approve this factory and it brought 300 jobs to this city. And they that's a stump speech for them. And they're going to do the same thing with Bitcoin. And they're going to be good quality jobs probably. So absolutely, it's going to be involved in politics going forward. I just don't know how big it's going to be this year, but 2028, 2032, it could be huge, especially if the number continues to go up. Then all of a sudden you have these people with a lot of resources as well that want to keep those resources. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from my perspective, it's like today the S&P 500 is in a way like the savings account of millions and millions of Americans all over the US. And it's like if the S&P 500 falls 20%, 50%, obviously it hasn't done that, I guess, since maybe 2008, if it even did 50%. But that's like pretty catastrophic, and a lot of things are going wrong. If we're right about Bitcoin, it becomes gold, then like digital gold, and then even potentially larger. It's like that becomes a major portion of America's savings. And it's like, to some extent, like you can't let it go down too much, just like you can't let the S&P 500 go down too much or real estate go down too much. It just becomes, systemic to the financial system and could cause, an uproar basically from the people.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like a double-edged sword too, because on the one hand, they'll want to, right now, like the dollar has all these things propping it up. The stock market has all of these people that are in, like when I say people, like leaders of our country, or like they're very determined to keep the stock market high because it's their constituents' livelihoods and things things like that. And so Bitcoin really isn't that for most people. Although for some people, it is increasingly becoming their savings account and their livelihoods, and it's a very serious thing to watch it go down. But I think for the most part, people are kind of mentally prepared for it, at least right now. But if as you say, Bitcoin becomes more and more of one of those assets that we can't let go down, you got to be careful that the government doesn't use that as kind of clause to dig into the Bitcoin protocol and try to push it this way or that way, because we have to, quote unquote, do something every time there's a crisis. And they could fundamentally, if enough people get behind the idea, it could fundamentally alter the protocol in a negative way that loses its independence from the traditional system, which I think it's a huge selling point for me and others, that it's kind of a parallel financial system. And it's great that we're incorporating it into the traditional financial system to get more people into it. But you have to kind of be vigilant to not let it go too far and then lose its value proposition, essentially.
Yeah, it's a good point. Last question, then we can probably go ahead and wrap it up, and you can end this, I guess, on an optimistic note or a pessimistic note, depending on your perspective. But what do you think about the future of the United States broadly and Bitcoin itself? Do you see them working together, being successful, being having the same ideology of freedom and individual responsibility, or do you see them clashing as they're maybe going in different directions? How do you think about that?
I think of Bitcoin very much as being very much in line with the traditional values of our country, kind of the founding values that we don't necessarily put up. I mean, we give a lot of lip service to today still, but I don't know if we necessarily act on them or require them in our day-to-day lives with our interactions with our government. In fact, a lot of times folks immediately just put them to one side when the going gets tough, and they just say, kind of, help me, look out for me, save me, all that. I understand the impulse, but the reality is the United States has definitely gone towards a less freedom-oriented country as we've gone on in our history. But that being said, the impulse is still very much there amongst a lot of people on both sides of the or all sides of the political spectrum. I don't want to say just Republicans and Democrats, but on all sides of the political spectrum, the impulse is very much there. And it just needs to be kind of cultivated. And I think that an idea like Bitcoin is a great way to cultivate that impulse for liberty and impulse for a lack of government intervention in our lives, because everyone gets to see right now in front of them in real time, Bitcoin perform with no help from the government at all, and often, very much being hindered by governments and other folks. And it is performing side by side with the current system, and they're getting to see, who's winning, how this is playing out. And right now, it's hard to say that Bitcoin isn't gaining ground on the traditional system. And I think it offers a lot of people an excellent escape valve. Anyone who wants to think, how can I hedge against the current system, even if you like the current system, but you're just concerned with where it's heading, it gives you a peaceful way to kind of dovetail back into those values that we all still keep in the back of our head, that we feel are important, but we maybe don't always give them enough attention these days, because for one reason or another. So it's an excellent process to watch play out, and it's really well suited here in the United States, because amongst all other countries in the world, we really do give people a good chance to kind of do for themselves if they want to. And we just have to be careful, though, because our impulse to overcorrect on things can come back and bite Bitcoin if anything ever goes wrong. So you always have to be vigilant and keeping your elected officials honest and demonstrating to them how important this asset is to you, and eventually will be to them. But I think the United States can certainly be an excellent catalyst for Bitcoin, but it can also be a huge, huge problem for it if it wants to be. And we all have to kind of just be our own evangelists for it, and continuing talking to those who have their hands on the lever of power. And the best thing is we don't need really any help. We just need you to leave us alone, and we'll be very happy.
I like it. Bryan, this was an awesome conversation. Where can the people go learn more about you and what you do?
I'm still on Twitter. So, I mean, I'm also on Damus too. So I use Nostr, and but I'm mostly on Twitter X, sorry. And you can find me at my name there. I think it's in the bottom corner. It's Bryan Jacoutot. And check me out there. And if what I do for a living is I go, I'm a litigator. I'm typically in federal court. And one of the things I'm trying to expand is things like we saw Riot do out in Texas with that TRO order in federal court. You ever, if your company or whatever ever needs a litigator in Georgia, let me know. I'm happy to help, and I'd love to help with any Bitcoin focused company and achieving their goals. And if we have to go to litigation, we have to go to litigation. We'll make sure it goes as well as it can. And I think it's good to have experienced litigators who know not just the courts, but also Bitcoin. So that's kind of my value proposition for folks.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to hear. But Bryan, thanks. This is awesome.
Yep. Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.